data reveals massive racial gaps in nearly all quality of life metrics. Compared to whites, the average African American is 6 times more likely to be incarcerated, twice as likely to be a victim of police violence, and twice as likely to be in poverty. These racial inequities are the inevitable result of slavery. According to a county-by-county statistical analysis by Harvard, Lake and Nunn, slavery has reduced modern-day incomes by 20% for all Americans living in ex-slave counties. York University's Niles Lagerlof then broke down these findings by race. By unsurprisingly, African Americans oppose 100% of this drop. The logical response to this systematic wrong is reparations. Reparations accomplish two things. They account and acknowledge the injustice that the United States perpetuated and help to ameliorate some of the gap. According to Brian Jacob of NVER, every $1,000 in cash transfers, by decreasing stressors to find money, increases graduation probability by up to 7 percentage points, and in fact, twice as large as current interventions. As a result, Dalton of the New York Times says that $35,000 would eliminate the education gap, which is essential because according to Bruce Weber of Oregon State, each year of education reduces poverty risk by 39%. Contention 2 is the legacy of segregation. For decades, the U.S. pursued racist policies such as redlining, white-only suburb construction, slum-destroying mega-highway construction, and exclusionary zoning that pushed many African Americans to de facto segregated communities of concentrated poverty. To this day, NYU's Patrick Sharkey notes that a majority of black families have lived in the poorest quartile neighborhoods for consecutive generations. The effect of this segregation is devastating. Todd Hasse quotes the Atlantic says, whites are worth roughly 1/20th for white counterparts and are 15 times more likely to grow up poor. Tulane's Stacey Sachadra finds that present-day segregation reduces access to job, educational, and health services, with the result being large disparities in all of those fields. In fact, when Wall Street's Melvin Oliver conducted a logistic regression analysis, he found that 75% of that wealth gap was due to racist policy. This disturbing legacy provides a moral imperative to act. The University of Michigan's Elizabeth Anderson writes, since segregation is an injustice, its remedy is an imperative of justice. As Boston University's David Lyons explains, corrective justice requires that the U.S. make amends for the problems that it created. According to Arizona State's Alfred Brophy, reparations do just that. They require not just acknowledging culpability, but making a concerted effort to ameliorate the problem. That means that reparations require not just acknowledging the government's role in segregation, but actively taking steps to desegregate. UC Berkeley's Robert Johnson finds that school desegregation massively improves all quality of life metrics, from earnings to education to incarceratory risk. According to Alana Samuels of Slate magazine, integration helps reduce racist views among whites, because it's harder to maintain stereotypes about groups when you work, live, and interact with them. Perhaps most importantly, Anderson finds other anti-poverty programs like welfare can never succeed without first achieving integration, because distribution of resources and services can never be equitable as long as housing and schooling is still so segregated. Desegregation is eminently feasible. Anderson finds that housing vouchers, school vouchers, and race-conscious school redistricting help to integrate communities in schools. Will Fisher of the CVP finds that vouchers reduce parental burden by 80%, and the Children's Defense Fund finds that spending $25 billion per year on housing vouchers reduce black child poverty by 25%. Heather Schwartz of the Century Foundation finds that other policies, such as mandating affordable and integrated units in new housing developments, empirically work to integrate and improve student outcomes. Other measures, such as increased job training, help to integrate the workplace, and aggressive enforcement of outstanding desegregation orders can assist as well. Joe Fagan of Texas A&M finds that reparations in the form of community rehabilitation or seed capital to build small businesses is critical to the full rebuilding of Black America. All in all, the U.S. federal government actively promoted segregation. Because reparations both recognize this wrong and make efforts to correct them, we are very proud to affirm.
Can I see one source?
Sure.
I think it was, I'm not sure if it was the New York Times, but basically about the 35,000.
Okay. Yeah, I have it right now. I'm just highlighting. Here we go. You're back.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just going to get out my time before And it's just the whole highlighted section?
Yeah. Okay. And it's not the full article. I'll read it.
Okay, I'm going to start correct. No.
That is what you requested?
Sorry?
That was what you requested?
Yeah.
No.
indicate the resolution result. The United States federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans. We would like to offer the following observations. First, under Immanuel Kant's basic philosophical tenet of ought implies can, the probe must first show the practical and beneficial implementation of reparations. As the resolution questions whether the federal government has a duty to pay reparations, the affirmative must first prove that they could do so, because it would be unfair and useless to insist that a person or group has a duty to do something that they cannot do. Moreover, when weighing, it's important to analyze the impacts of reparations, as the government both has a moral and lawful obligation to help its citizens. Second, the probe must prove reparations for African Americans would include a non-repetition guarantee. As explained by Professor Maxine Burkett from the University of Colorado Law School, when establishing a successful reparation campaign, quote, the most vital element is non-repetition, and therefore an apology or remuneration alone are therefore insufficient. End quote. Thus, PROMA showed that reparations would include a non-repetition guarantee prior to accessing any of their impacts or reasons for reparations. Third, the resolution specifies that the reparations must be paid, implying a monetary value of reparations. Contention on economics, subpoint A, the transfer problem. As explained by law professor Roy Brooks at the University of Notre Dame, quote, a reparation is the tangible act that transforms the rhetoric of an apology into a meaningful material reality, end quote. An important aspect of the apology is that it does not damage the recipients of the apology. A transfer of money would not mitigate current income inequality, but instead exacerbate it in the long term. As explained by William Darity, economist at Duke University, black-owned businesses comprise, quote, only 4% of the 20.8 million non-farm businesses in the United States and generated a mere 0.4% of the $18.6 trillion in receipts for all non-farm businesses in the United States, end quote. As a result, in a variety of models for reparations, Darity concluded that, quote, the income of blacks would decrease and the income of non-blacks would increase. And thus, as a result, there would be a secondary blessing for non-blacks and a secondary burden on blacks due to the reparations payment, end quote. If reparations have long-term negative impacts to the African-American community that receives them, the United States federal government ought not give them. Subpoint B, hindering the United States economy. According to the most recent calculations by Thomas Kramer, researcher at the University of Connecticut, reparations are estimated to cost the U.S. government from $5.9 to $14.2 trillion. With the current U.S. fiscal budget of $3.9 trillion, even the most conservative of Kramer's estimates would be $2 trillion more than the entire U.S. spending in 2015. Even if the reparations were a fraction of the estimated cost, they would greatly deplete U.S. spending. According to the United States Budget Committee, the largest item in the federal budget since 2011 has been the welfare program, which would likely be diminished greatly if reparations are given. Not only would this hurt Americans as a whole, but it would disproportionately affect African Americans. Despite comprising only 12% of the total population, African Americans receive approximately 40% of all social welfare programs. Once again, with reparations having long-term negative impacts in the black community, the U.S. ought not give them. Contention to exacerbating racial tensions. While reparations are intended to act as compensation for injustice against blacks, they merely serve to appease the guilt of white Americans and governmental officials. As explained by Glenn Laurie of the New York Times, quote, reparations would allow the majority of Americans to look at the situation as one where we can do something for them, alleviate their suffering, solve their problems, quiet their protests, and then once the debt is paid off, wash our hands clean of society's inequities, end quote. Reparations would end important racial conversations and disrupt the positive changes occurring in the status quo, because white Americans would feel absolved of any responsibility. Law professor Eric Yamamoto explains the negative consequences that this would have. Quote, redress and reparations could in the long term unwittingly be seduced into becoming just one more means of social control that attempts to neutralize the need to strive for justice, end quote. While negatively disrupting social changes, reparations would also ensure that no positive legislation changes are made, exacerbating racial tensions and perpetuating systemic racism. For these reasons and more, Julian and I urge a calm ballot. Thank you.
There's one card I'd like to see. I'd like to try to lead us from someone from Duke saying,
oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In the study, he goes through a few models, and then he comes to the conclusion.
Right. You scroll down to the conclusion, or what do you?
I have
whatever you
I have
say.
a conclusion.
Thank you. That's like 15 seconds to use.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. So in 1986, we passed Native American reparations.
Okay.
What happened 2 years later following the reparations?
I'm not sure. Can you tell me?
We passed the Japanese American reparations. So when you said
Okay.
that passing one reparations means you don't do anything in the
So
future,
this is
how was
really
it the last time we passed it? We
Okay.
started
So
passing
this
more
is
with
really
policies.
important because with Japanese internment, what you're talking about, that had a start date and an end date. That had a non-repetition
What about
guarantee,
no-
as well as the fact that Yamamoto states that what happened afterwards was white
No,
man's
okay, wait. I said Native American reparations, which is nothing to do with it. What we said is the 1986 Native American reparations created a movement that could create the Japanese American reparations. So when you say that we're suddenly this just government and we can wipe our hands clean, why is it the last time we passed it, we begat more progress?
Okay, but then again, you're ignoring what I just said about the Japanese internment. Okay.
Wait,
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So does the government have an obligation to harm its people?
Wait, it doesn't have an obligation to harm its people.
Okay.
But I think what you're going for this is like, we ought to weigh utilitarian impacts, right?
Well, no, what I'm going for this is that since we've shown throughout our entire case that African Americans would be, as a whole, affected negatively by reparations payment, then we shouldn't give them.
Okay, well, 2 things. One is we're going to prove Sam's going to negate them. We're going to win with the utilitarian framework. But second, we'll ask you in the court of law, does the justice care about like how the money is in a restitution case, how that money is spent? Like if I trick Bill Gates and he breaks his like femur and I pay $10,000 in restitution, the $10,000 would probably be a lot better spent in my hands. But does justice care about that?
I don't really understand.
But Bill Gates doesn't build that many billions of dollars. He doesn't need my $10,000. But justice doesn't care that my money would be better spent in my hands where I can invest in my education. If a wrong is done, we pay, regardless of how that money is then spent. Justice doesn't care about that.
Okay, but what you're talking about assumes that the people that are recipients aren't being harmed like this.
No,
Like, Bill
I'm saying
Gates
is that
isn't
I'm
being-
harmed.
and I was
Yeah.
like, Bill Gates isn't being harmed by the fact that we're giving him money because
Okay.
he broke his feet.
What I would contend is if we're giving, say, $25 billion per year in housing vouchers, the people getting vouchers who can now reduce their rent over to like 80%
Okay.
are not being harmed. The poverty reduction rate of 39% is not a harm
Where is
to
this money?
economic
Where is
growth.
this money coming from again?
The U.S. federal government.
Okay, but like how are we getting the money?
Okay,
This
we
is
have
$25
three.
billion.
You said we have $3 trillion in the budget. $25 billion is at most less than 2%.
Okay, so do you know how many African Americans currently survive off of welfare?
You said 40% of the welfare rolls are African American.
So that's 17 million African Americans.
$25 billion is not going to wipe away the welfare program. That doesn't make any sense. Can you explain why that's true?
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, so in your second contention, you talk about like segregation of housing and redlining.
Yes.
So is this still occurring today?
Segregation of housing, yeah, there's still a huge
So then
burden.
how can we pay reparations for it if we need a non-repetition guarantee?
What we say is when you have housing vouchers, you integrate, right? And when you have integration, you reduce racism. That's the linkage to non-repetition.
You will sit down. We'll be taking some brief running prep time, please. Starting now. Okay, thank you. That was another 15 used there. That's 12, 15. So we've used 27 overall.
Are my opponents ready? Are my judges ready? Is my brother ready? Okay. Let's start with my opponent's observation. First, they give you this analysis saying that ought implies can, but we have to show the practical implementation. However, because the intent to owe reparations to try to atone for past wrong, when we have to prove that it can possibly be achieved, that just means we have to prove that we can actually atone for the past wrong. This is really, really important, because when they tell you that the implications of this standard is that we need to be looking at the utilitarian impacts, which is really ironic because their own author, Kant, was a leading critic of utilitarian impacts. That, the reason he gives, is that when you have a place where the minority is being oppressed by the majority, a system that says always do it to the greatest good for the greatest number will necessarily prioritize the interests of the majority over that of the minority, which is really bad when we're trying to promote racial justice. Instead, that under my opponent's own reasoning, therefore, we should instead prefer the analysis that if the intent is to try to compensate for past wrongs, if we prove to you that the past wrongs are sufficient enough in order to warrant compensation, then you should pass an affirmative ballot off of that. Then go on to the next observation, saying that we need to prove non-repetition. First, even if there's a tiny risk of non-repetition, even if we're improving people's lives, that's still going to be a net positive. But second, the problem, this is something that my brother alluded to in Crossfire, which is that we are reducing the risk of non-repetition. The reason is that Samuels explains that if we accept the basic premise that racism stems from ignorance, that by integrating communities you're more likely to reduce racism, that's going to be reducing the risk of repetition. Then they give you this observation saying that all reparations have to be monetary. The reason why you shouldn't prefer this definition is because Joe Fagan of Texas A&M explains that right now, the most likely form of reparations is in the form of, say, community reparations to help neighborhoods. As a result, it's not monetary. Do not buy their assertion. Now, to the first contention, which talks about the problems of transferring money. On to their subpoint A. They're a little unclear about what this means, but after calling the evidence, it becomes a little clearer. The argument basically says is that it's going to be bad if we give money to African Americans because they're just going to be spending it on businesses that whites own, and that's going to help whites and not African Americans. There's two problems with this. First, if you give money to an individual and they spend it on basic needs, that's still a net positive for the individual. As a result, we are going to be improving people's lives. Second, it assumes that we're only going to be giving monetary reparations to the point where we're going to be seeing more likely that's going to be a form of housing vouchers or other ways to improve communities and neighborhoods. That means that none of the harms they're talking about are actually going to be occurring in the real world. Now onto their subpoint B, which talks about how the cost is really high. And they say it's going to cost $5.9 to $14.2 trillion. It's telling that they're citing an opponent of reparations when estimating the cost. Because of course an opponent is going to be inflating the cost of reparations in order to doom it. Because here's the thing, what we're telling you is that $25 billion in housing vouchers each year can reduce poverty by 25%. We spend $25 billion every single day. That's not going to be a big impact. But second, keep in mind that when we pass reparations, it doesn't automatically come in the forms that my opponents dictated. It's going to come in whatever the most likely form is. Because when we look at Congress right now, they are fiscally conservative. That means they're less likely to be passing this extravagant spending measure, which means in the real world, we're going to be seeing it's much more likely that these smaller spending amounts are what's going to exist. But then they tell you that it's going to be cutting welfare, but as my brother alluded to in Crossfire, that's just an assertion. They give you no reason to suspect it. They just say it's going to cost a lot of money and welfare is expensive, therefore we're going to cut welfare. That's not a syllogism, don't let them extend this. Now into the next contention, which talks about racial tension. This idea that by appeasing white guilt, we're less likely to act. The first big problem comes from author Tim Wise, who explains that what happens when you pass a reparation scheme is that you make people more aware not only of the problems that African Americans faced in the past, but the problems that still persist today. As a result, you're more likely to be seeing action. The second problem is also something my brother alluded to in Crossfire, which is that progress begets progress. We saw the Native American reparations. That's what led and snowballed into the Japanese American reparations, which snowballed into the Rosewood Riot reparations. We're seeing that when you pass one measure, you call attention to these issues, meaning we're more likely to be passing these measures in the long term. The third big problem is that they assume that absent reparations, we would be passing meaningful reform. Just looking at Congress right now would to tell you that's simply not true, and that's why you should affirm. Thank you.
We're running away from.
really important observation. Remember, we need to be looking at the practical impacts of reparations, because if reparations harm the group they're intended to help, the government clearly doesn't have an obligation to give them. Meaning, if we can show the exacerbation of income inequality, as well as the exacerbation of social issues, including a lack of policy reforms because of reparations, you would see a negative impact in the long term, meaning you need to negate. Even if we have a moral obligation, if the moral obligation would then harm the people that it's intended to help, you can't be affirming throughout this round. Meaning, if we can show that, you need to negate. But let's look to their first contention, where they talk about quality of life. A few big problems. First, remember what we're going to continue to tell you throughout this round. Because of the white appeasement, and when they talk about the examples of the Japanese internment camp, look to the case we read in the source we're reading case, Eric Yamamoto, who looks after Japanese internment camps and realizes that there was white appeasement, which led to less policy reforms. Meaning, because of that, you saw a net negative result. Looking to their own examples, you're going to see the problems, and you're going to see why you're going to see less policy reforms. Meaning, when they're talking about things like police targeting and mass incarceration, you're not addressing the root of the problems. Meaning, you're not stopping things like the war on drugs, and you're further exacerbating the issues and ensuring that they continue into the future because you're not putting non-repetition on it. Meaning, they're showing no solvency, and they're not helping the status quo. But even more importantly, looking to the studies about the $3,500 solving the education inequality gap. The big problem here is when you're going to cross-apply our second contention when we talk about the transfer problem. Because we're going to show the exacerbation of income inequality, what you're actually going to see is that education inequality will be exacerbated as well, because that's the basic assumption that their study relies on. Meaning, because of that, you're not only going to see income inequality exacerbated, but you're also going to see education inequality exacerbated. Meaning, you're going to turn their contention on its head because you're hurting in the long run. That's going to be really important. But let's look to their second contention, where they talk about segregation, and they talk about things like redlining. A few big problems. First off, the first and the biggest problem is that redlining is now occurring in more implicit ways. According to the United States Department of Housing and Development, quote, black homebuyers who contact agencies about recently advertised home for sale are doing about 17% fewer available homes and are shown about 18% fewer units. Meaning, things like housing vouchers wouldn't be effective solvency because they don't address the root of the problem. Again, you're putting a band-aid solution on a deeper issue. This is really important because that's explained by Eric Koser of the University of Chicago. Quote, we will say that reparations are schemes are justified on the basis of backward-looking reasons of compensation, but not on forward-looking reasoning. Meaning, you can't look to what could happen in the future. You need to look what's happened in the past, and it's not going to be helping in the future. But even more importantly, look to John Elliott of the New York Times, who investigates Section 8 housing vouchers in places like St. Louis and sees that there's even more rent discrimination when housing vouchers were given out. Meaning, you're actually exacerbating the issue because you're seeing these housing vouchers aren't actually being effective. But even when they're looking to things like education vouchers as well, a few more big problems. The way that education vouchers work is they basically put people from public schools into private schools, meaning they're one, overcrowding schools, but two, the reason public schools exist in the first place is to ensure that everyone can have an education without overcrowding these schools, meaning they're not actually helping the system, instead they're harming it. The central problem here is because of the transfer problem, where we're showing the exacerbation of income inequality, what you're actually going to see is that then public schools in white communities will actually increase in quality because they're based on taxes. Again, you're seeing a net harm here. So that's why you can't be affirming right there. But also, looking to something, when they talk about this idea of, like, when they say that there will be more changes and more progress in the future, again, remember it's going to be really important that we're actually looking to the historical precedent and we see that the white appeasement has occurred. But even more importantly, the examples they give were already ended, meaning it was a past event that had stopped and was then done. That's what you need to negate. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to get this.
For most of your responses, you cross-outline your case in some way. And one of the ones that you keep repeating is the idea that income inequality gets worse, you're harming its intended beneficiaries, and thus you should negate. Is that a correct characterization of what you said? Okay. How much does income inequality get worse if you pass reparations?
I mean, I can't tell you, like, it will go exact, like 10%, I can't tell you the exact number if we're looking at that study, because, I mean, that's you explain a lot in your case, you're talking about things like monetary reparations. You talk about like $35,000 in this situation, $35 in this situation, $1,000 $100,000 in this situation, and because of that, that's where we're looking. That we're showing that.
I don't need an exact number. I just need a range, a scale, a set, like an order of magnitude. Because if income inequality goes up by 80%, that's not a big deal. There's a lot. It is a big deal.
The reason that the study can't estimate that is because, as you say, we don't know the exact number that reparations would be. That's
we do a lot of possible policy options.
Okay,
most likely.
Okay, the
so we
problem
can't actually
now,
estimate
it wasn't like you gave the author who's conducting the study the number before and then said, oh, I'm going to calculate this for Sam because I really want to help him.
Thank you.
It would have been nice if you did.
However, bottom line though, how do we weigh your impact if we don't know how much income inequality goes up? Or even in order of
Because
magnitude?
if it goes up at all, it's a harm. And the reason is, what you're going to...
If I get $1, and Will gives me $1, right?
Sure.
Then we're now unequal, right? So, but that's not a huge deal, right?
No,
so
but
clearly
if it's
matters
happening
in
on a
how
large
it's
scale,
set
it's happening on a large scale between white communities and black communities, what you're going to see there is going to exacerbate exacerbate housing segregation, and two, exacerbate education inequality.
But we dispute the link there. But you yourself just said you don't know the sense of magnitude. Are we talking one?
Because it depends on the amount of reparations that you're giving. That's what I'm trying to explain. Okay, I already explained why we can't do that because he doesn't get that evidence first. Okay, so can we talk about this idea of you said you dropped the link, right? So your big idea, like you said that you dropped the link on there.
No, I said we dispute the link.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So you're saying you dispute the link, right?
Yeah.
You're saying your main idea here is that it wouldn't be a monetary transfer, right?
That was one that you probably
Okay, cool. So in your first contention, don't you say that $35,000 of a monetary transfer from the New York Times?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm a little confused because one, you're saying that we wouldn't do a monetary transfer, and two, you're
No,
saying we're going to do a monetary transfer to solve it.
No, I understand the confusion. But the difference here is that when you're talking this $35,000 helping people spend on education. The reason why that distinction is important is because your entire link into this income inequality is that people are going to be getting money, African Americans, individuals are going to be getting money and spending it on white businesses. Spending on education and spending on white businesses are not identical.
So we can be sure that if we give reparations, the first thing they're going to do, they're not going to go to any business, they're not going to buy anything, they're going to say, oh, we're only going to use this money for education.
We're out of time, but I assure you will address that in a second.
Okay, thanks. That's great.
I believe you'll be having some running prep time, please. Thank you. So you don't spend using stressors means avoid this. This is exactly that was 18 seconds you said. On top of 27, it's 45 seconds. Ready? Can everyone hear me? I'm not sure. First, on the observation that Sam repeats is that justice doesn't care about popular opinion, doesn't care about dollar and cents. Justice cares about whether the wrong was done and whether we ought to pay, so their utilitarian impacts come second. But even with that, we're going to win under the utilitarian framework. The first voter issue in the ground is going to be compensating for slavery. The response from Yamamoto, who didn't pass policy reform after Japanese American reparations. The reason is there's no need for policy reform in the Japanese American. There's no income gap, there's no education gap. So the Japanese American reparations is not an appropriate example. Then we give you the Jacob analysis that they cold drop. That $1,000 in no strings attached cash transfers increases graduation rates by 7 percentage points. Because when you decrease stressors to find money, people can focus on things that they need. Even if some of that money is going to go to what businesses, that's not a net harm because people are getting services from it. And on balance, the education outweighs for the long term. Then on the Conley evidence, it's $35,000. If you scale up that 1,000 to 35,000, you eliminate the gap. We can actually quantify our decrease in inequality. They're just giving you some estimate. They're not actually quantifying. We're saying you eliminate the education gap. We are like that is a structural improvement when people are more educated that leads to less inequality in the long term. The second voter issue around is revenue and segregation. They say the redlining still occurs, so it's not going to be effective. Even if we don't solve all the problems, still improving people's lives with the 80% less rental burden and by decreasing racism through desegregation. Then they say we have to justify backwards looking, but that's outdated. Brophy says that the poster definition is outdated, and modern reparations aren't like that. Then they give you this problem about Section 8 housing not being good. Section 8 housing, what we're advocating for, is not the same. Section 8 housing is public housing. What we're advocating with like hard income caps, what we're advocating for is racial housing, so we still get linked into our evidence, and the school vouchers is literally not our advocacy, so drop those responses. They cool drop the CDF, Children's Defense Fund evidence. There's $25 billion in housing vouchers, decreases African American poverty by 25%. A, this means it's not too expensive, so we cross-apply there. Second, by reducing poverty, you reduce inequality. We can't weigh their inequality impact, we can weigh ours. And third, from Samuel's immigration decreases racism. On complacency, remember why, since you raise awareness, which is why progress begets progress. The Civil Rights Act begat the Voting Rights Act, the Native American reparations begat the Japanese American reparation. It snowballs, creates a broader social policy movement. For all these reasons, we are very proud to affirm.
We're going to take voting back.
We're going to start pressing now.
Yeah, that's like, you said Section 8 when we're, but no. Section 8 is public housing.
I have like 35 seconds.
Are the judges ready? Julie, ready? Then let's begin. Judges, if paying reparations is hurting African Americans in the long term, we simply cannot do it. We show through income inequality exacerbating racial tensions that it will, and we have to be looking to the root of the problem here, and paying trillions of dollars in reparations will simply not address the root of the problem. Now moving on to their points. The first point is talking about legacy of slavery, quality of life, and they talk a lot about mass incarceration, but because of white appeasement, you're going to be seeing less policy reform that could actually help mass incarceration, because they're not actually addressing the root of the problem. We showed with the Yamamoto evidence that after Japanese American reparations, which they cite, the white appeasement went up and it perpetuated systemic racism. Now moving on to education and equality, it will be exacerbated as well because of the transfer problem, which shows the exacerbation in income inequality. Because public schools are paid for with taxes that whites pay, what's going to happen is we're going to see the transfer problem come into full effect. They make the assumption that if we give them money, that they will automatically go and spend money on education. However, it is much more likely that they will go and spend it on goods. Now moving on to this whole segregation of housing, look to our NY Time evidence, which states that the housing vouchers will simply not help. It doesn't matter because they neglect to understand that it does not address the root of the problem and nothing will help. As well as the fact that it's still occurring, so it will never actually have a solution unless it's over. Moving on to our points, economics. We assume that blacks were centered on white-owned businesses. What they don't understand is that statistically, since 96% of all businesses are white-owned, it will actually go back into the pockets of the white taxpayers that were paying the reparations to begin with. Therefore, it's a net harm to blacks and it's a net benefit to whites. Now moving on to the U.S. economy, they don't understand that over 17 million African Americans are currently surviving off of welfare, and since this is the biggest program in the U.S. federal budget, it will be cut first. And moving on to exacerbating racial tensions, we're saying that it will harm African Americans and it will ensure that policy reform isn't made. We need to continue the conversation that has been sparked by grassroots movements such as Black Lives Matter, because reparations would ensure that no positive legislation changes are made because these legislators will adopt a SOA mentality. Since we've already paid trillions and trillions of dollars, why should we do any more? For these reasons, we urge a calm ballot. Thank you.
We're doing very well.
Yeah, because just so we're not yelling at us.
Yeah, I like that.
So you tell us that spending, African American spending on white businesses is going to exacerbate income inequality, and that's bad, right?
Yeah, basically, because the really important thing is, like, I get you're talking about, like, oh, it's good if they, like, can buy goods, but the problem is here, it's basically only for helping, like, it might help a little bit in the short term, but it's gonna hurt significantly more in the long term, and the reason here is simple. You're basically investing in these businesses. Yeah. So it's not only making giving money to the businesses, it's ensuring that the businesses thrive in the long term.
Okay. But like for instance, this bagel comes from Stop and Shop, right?
Yeah.
So I spent I did. So if I spent the money there, the guy who owns Stop and Shop, he also owns Giant too, probably richer than I am. So at your logic, that's exacerbating income inequality. Does that mean every single time I buy from a business whose owner is richer than I am, that's net harm to society?
No, that's not what we're saying here. What we're saying here is basically the idea that you're missing is that you're not addressing the root problem. Meaning, it's not just like that there are richer people out there. It's the fact that 99 or 96% of businesses are white owned. Because of that, you're not addressing the root problem. I mean, yeah, it's exacerbating income inequality. It's making you poorer and making someone else richer. That's
that means every single time you buy from a business who's richer, whose owner is richer, then that's net harm. Is that true?
I guess.
Okay, but like so we should never buy from a business whose owner is richer?
Not what we're saying. What we're saying here is that you're not addressing the root problem.
Not addressing all the problem is not the same thing as a net harm, right?
No.
You can address a lot of the problem, not even all of it. That's
No.
not.
We're not saying that you're addressing anything. We're saying you're putting a coating on the surface of a deeper issue. Meaning the issue being the percentage of white-owned businesses compared to black-owned businesses.
Okay, well,
we're not saying you compared to the person owning Stop and Shop. We're saying the person that are being redlined, the people in these ghettos that are going to the large corporations and are putting money back into them. That's the start difference becoming your example.
But second, okay, let's talk about like policy reform, right? We talked about licensing. Your big evidence, in fact, the only link is we didn't have policy reform after Japanese immigration. Yeah, we're just talking about that. That's speculative, but yeah, Yam goes from Japanese immigration. What policy reform do we need for Japanese immigration?
He was more talking about the idea of appeasement, meaning they felt no obligation to follow the law.
Yeah, Japanese Americans. What do we need to do for Japanese Americans? There wasn't an education gap. There wasn't an income gap.
Are you saying that they don't suffer?
I would say that there wasn't an income gap.
That actually isn't true. After Japanese internment camps, there were still renters.
This was in the 90s.
Okay, and there was discrimination in the 90s.
Can we give you 45 seconds to prep? We'll be taking our remaining 1 minute and 15 seconds. Thank you. Thank you. My pen is ready. Is my brother ready? Yeah. No, my judge is ready. First, on this idea of framework, my opponents never engaged with the idea that Will and I repeated repeatedly throughout the round, that that justice does not care about whether people dislike reparations, justice does not care about the cost. What justice cares about is whether or not the wrong done in the past is sufficient enough to warrant compensation today. That should be the standard you use in this round. However, we're still going to be winning under my opponent's own consequentialist framework. The main place you should be casting your balance this round is off this legacy of slavery and segregation. What Will and I show you repeatedly is that we still see the effects of slavery and segregation lingering in today's society in the forms of higher poverty rate, higher incarceration rates, worse educational outcomes, etc. Now, they respond to this by saying that it's going to be still net positive, but you're going to be seeing less policy reform. But they ignore two key things Will and I are telling you. One, is that absent reparations, we're not going to be seeing these policy reforms as even casual observers of the current political system in Washington would recognize. But second, they ignore this idea that progress begets progress. That what Wise tells you is that when you have reparations, you call attention to the systematic oppression that the United States committed against African Americans in the past, and the disadvantage that they still face in the status quo. As a result, we're more likely to be passing these policies if you were to pass reparations. Do not let my opponents respond to this in the next speech. Then they say there's going to be these transfer problems, which are actually making the problem worse. They ignore the fact that that's not true that every single time you spend on a business that is richer than you, that's a net positive, that's a net negative. That's simply not true. You get in services, that's a positive. And second, they don't even quantify their impact at all. You can't weigh it. Then they say that we're assuming that if you give money, you're spending it on education. But as Will and I point out, that's not the assumption we're making. What happens is if the primary cause of people dropping out of school, although they say it's boredom, is actually because they need to provide money for their family, reducing the stressors that they need to provide money for their family, it's going to make them more likely to stay in school. This is really important because we were showing you empirically that as well, that's reducing poverty 39%. Here's how this wins us around. One, under our framework, we're telling you this means the wrong in the past is sufficient enough to justify compensation today. And under their framework, to the point where we're reducing poverty and solving the structural problems of racism means that because under both of our frameworks, reparations are just, we strongly urge you to affirm. Thank you.
I just need one source.
Yeah, I mean, it's final focus, so you can't really. But you can, if you just want.
Well, just the name of the source.
Yeah, sure.
That said that like one of the reparations led to the next one, or was it just like?
That's your own source. Yamamoto. Yamamoto says that in Wise.
But like, did you mean like he said it or just like happened? No.
But Wise says it will happen, and Yamamoto says it has happened.
I think we have like a minute left. Continue to come up here and tell you that justice only cares about the wrongdoing. But if the response to the wrongdoing would hurt the people the wrong was done against, you can't affirm. Because we've shown that throughout this round, you're going to exacerbate income inequality, you're going to hurt social changes, and you're going to ensure that policy reforms aren't made in the long term, you can't be affirming. And that's really important. All they tell you is that justice only cares about wrongdoing, but if we're debating whether slavery was wrong, it's clear that pro would win. That's an unfair burden which we've shown throughout this round. But looking to their points, when they talk about education,
Remember, they basically drop this in final focus, but quickly. They talk about this $35,000, but remember what I tell you, it's dependent on the income inequality, and because we show the exacerbation, you're going to see that in the long term, it's actually going to increase education inequality. Also with housing vouchers, remember the implicit response, which we talk about because redlining is occurring in more implicit ways. Housing vouchers actually wouldn't represent any solvency. Instead, they would ensure that discrimination occurs in more rampant levels. But even more importantly, when they talk about progress begets progress, remember that discrimination still occurred after the Japanese internment camps, which they don't respond to. But even more importantly, remember the Yamamoto card, which shows that it actually served to appease white Americans more than it helped Japanese Americans. Meaning, you're not seeing their impacts in their own historical precedent, but looking to our points about their transfer problem. Remember, their biggest response here is one that it helps goods, but remember we tell you, you're putting the coating on the surface of a deeper issue. Get to the problems, don't solve it through reparations, but their other response is that it wouldn't be monetary value, but remember what they then tell you in their own first contention. If you're gonna cross-apply their own first contention to their own response. You have to negate right there. Because you're exacerbating income inequality, it will also harm education inequality. Remember, if you're putting a coating on the surface and you're not getting to the deeper issue again, you're going to be harming them. But also, again, with the policy reforms, you're going to see that a SOA mentality is adopted, as they tell you with the New York Times evidence, which they don't respond to. Meaning, in the long term, you're going to see that less policy and less legislation is targeted to stop things like mass incarceration and education inequality like they want you to believe. Thus, please negate.